moment, na, that centrifugal force also should be there. Actually, sir, when you are taking this F1x plus F2x in the class, you have taken their centrifugal force. But when you are balancing by moment balancing, that time you have not considered. That's only my doubt actually.
Okay. Okay, I will take a look at it again then. I don't think I have made a mistake. I'll take a look at it and get back to you. Okay.
Okay, okay, sir. Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thanks.
Hello, sir. Good morning.
Good morning. Yes.
Sir, will you please discuss about the midterm pattern, question pattern?
Okay, just before I answer that question, so Dinesh, coming back to your question about this centrifugal force.
Yes,
See,
sir.
you're writing the inertia matrix about the point of rotation at the bottom. Okay. So when you write
Okay,
the
sir.
inertia matrix about that point, you are not writing it about the center of mass. You are writing it about the
Okay.
point of rotation on the ground.
Okay,
Okay.
sir.
So when
Yes,
you
sir.
use parallel axis theorem to write
Okay.
down that equation correctly, right? So parallel axis theorem, in my opinion, will automatically allow you to incorporate the centrifugal component. Okay, because there is omega square r kind of a thing. I think it will automatically allow you to incorporate it. I'm still not 100% sure, but I'll get back to you on that. In my opinion, centrifugal force need not be separately included, but for this particular reason, because the inertia matrix is not about the center of mass. You're writing it about the the bottom, the point where the top is fixed to the ground. Okay, so when you write that way, I don't think centrifugal force comes into the picture. That's my rough answer, but
Okay, sir.
nevertheless,
I
I will
will.
check and get back to you.
Okay, sir.
So
I will see, sir, once more. Okay.
okay,
Okay.
yeah,
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
yeah. So there was this question on the structure, the pattern for the midterm. I think as of now, my thinking is that it will have a similar structure as your homeworks. Okay, but the number of problems will be chosen to be sure that you would be able to complete it within 1.5 hours. It will be during the class hours on December 1st or something. The next Tuesday, and as of now, my plan is to have the structure identical to what you would have for your homeworks. Okay, and also the questions that I would ask would be if you have done the homeworks, you would find it easy, in my opinion, to answer the questions that would be there in the midterm. Okay,
Sir, syllabus, sir.
it is everything till next week. See, this week is I will complete Lagrangian formalism next week. So whatever I would teach till next Thursday is what would be part of the syllabus.
Okay, sir. Actually, this multi-body dynamics, there, I think assignment will come late only.
I will be
But
sending
sir,
it tomorrow.
okay, okay, sir. So that's why, because single body dynamics and all we have completed, but multi-body, then if you put the exams, maybe some new to us.
That's why
Actually,
I
yes.
said I'll be sending the assignment tomorrow. So you will have ample time. You will have almost
Okay.
10 days for you to work out the exam, work out the problems in multi-body dynamics as well.
Okay, okay, sir. Okay, okay,
Yeah.
sir.
Sir, one more request.
Yes.
Sir, a few questions in the assignment was ambiguous to me.
Hmm.
Can I get the solutions? Because I couldn't understand that whether how on which way to approach or like that.
Yeah. So the easiest thing, if there is some ambiguity in questions, if some data has not been provided or some such thing, it is possible that it would have happened because I cook up these questions and it takes effort to make sure that all the data is provided and so on. So I may have missed out on providing one or two bits of information. The easiest thing is to bring that to my attention, and then I will take a look at it, and I will, uh, you know, send an email to everybody asking them to correct the question, or maybe I will replace the question
Yes,
paper.
sir, sir, but
Yeah.
yes, sir, but my suggestion is that to get the solution of the questions, because some of the questions I've done, but I'm not sure that on that way it will be correct or right, like that. So
So,
can you get me the solutions so that I can be sure
well,
that.
solutions we will be discussing as per our plan. We'll be discussing the solutions next week, maybe next weekend or something. We would have a special class just to discuss the solutions to the homeworks. More generally, however, we are more interested to see that your conceptual understanding is sound. Okay. Unfortunately, our training in our undergrad and your preparation for GATE and so on are such that you are focused on getting the answer right. Okay. In graduate school, however, whether you are a master student or a PhD student, we want to see that your understanding is sound. Your answer may be right, may not be right. We will not penalize you much. In fact, I personally don't care too much about the answer, and sometimes don't even work out the final answer for some of the problems that I give. Okay. It doesn't matter to me. What matters is whether your understanding is fine. I mean, if you're asked a problem, do you take the steps for solving the problem correctly? Logical flow, is that evident in the steps that you have taken? These are the kinds of things that are of importance to us. So you will probably get more than 90% or 80% credit if all those are fine. The remaining 20% or 10% credit alone is given to the answer. So unlike in the exams like GATE or somewhere else, where 100% credit goes to the final answer, regardless of what your understanding is, here it is different. So don't worry too much about the final answer. And this applies also to the midterm exam. Okay. I wouldn't care too much about whether you have calculated some quantity correctly to the last decimal place, or whether the expression that you have got is okay or not. Even if there are algebra mistakes, etc., I will be, I will, be very lenient on those matters. What I really care about is your understanding. Does that come through in the way you have approached the problem? Okay, so that's what I really care about. So even when we discuss the answers to the questions that that we have asked in the homeworks, we will not provide you the final answers. We are interested to see if the procedure that you have followed is right. Yeah, Dhanashri has a question.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Sir, regarding the proper set of generalized coordinates,
Yes.
we said that it is not unique, but rather the number of elements in that set in the proper set of generalized coordinates is fixed.
Yes.
So, sir, means if it is not unique, then we can choose any that's it, and we will get the same answer eventually.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
The
So,
dynamics will look different. In fact, we will take an example today. See the pendulum example where we took theta as that independent variable. We will today take the xy coordinates of the pendulum as the independent variables and solve the problem. Okay. The equations will look different, but if you convert xy to r theta, so length and theta, then the time evolution of theta will be the same as what you would get by directly solving the equation using theta as a generalized coordinate. There will be no difference.
okay, means sir, in case of 4-bar mechanism, where we took which has 1 degree of freedom, and where we took theta 1 as a proper set of generalized coordinates, we can take theta 2 or theta 3 also instead of theta 1.
Absolutely, any one of them. It's 1 degree of freedom. So compute the degrees of freedom of a mechanism, right? So based on that, you can pick any one of them as the member of the proper set.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Sir Rishikesh here. I had just one confirmation to be made from Swashplate problem. Sir, in that case, the bearing reactions that we are calculating in body frame, means with respect to shaft, they will have fixed direction, means in x direction.
Okay. Yes.
If we consider inertial frame, it will be rotating with speed omega z.
Correct.
That force vector.
Yes. So these reactions also rotate, therefore, with
Yes.
respect to the inertial frame at the same rate omega z.
Yes. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, sure.
Sir.
Yes.
Sir, actually, in class, sir, this there one the bowel and spin, sir, issue was there, na? In earth, it is not coming proper. So there, we should use the your same expression, or we should change it actually. Actually, you
I
told
gave the
this.
clarification. I gave the clarification in the next lecture, right? For Earth's Chandler wobble problem, what we refer to as spin speed and what we refer to as wobble speed, I discussed that at the start of the class. So that's what you would need to refer to. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Yeah.
Hello, sir. Initially, I was not asking you for the answers rather than the approaches, because some questions we have approached in some different ways. So I just wanted to know, is it correct or not, or can we do that?
So one thing you can do, Subhadip, is if you are very concerned, I mean, some of these will be discussed by Yogesh, as I said, in a separate class devoted to discussion of homework solutions. But if you are very keen, you can write to me, or you can just attach your answer sheet and send it to me and ask me to look at a specific, example, a specific problem, and whether your approach is okay or not. If you are interested, I can therefore view it as a question analogous to any other question that you guys might ask me. Okay, so here is what I have done. Is this okay? You can ask me. But I mean, Yogesh would also be discussing the solutions, and when he discusses the solutions, you can ask him if your alternate approach is okay, and he will also be able to answer it.
Sir, like many have asked me regarding their approach. I have told them personally also where they were wrong and all that. So if someone is feeling like okay, they should ask, they can ask me freely. I'll tell them.
Yeah, that's also fine. And if you do not agree with Yogesh, I'm sure Yogesh would have provided very convincing justifications for his for the way he has corrected your question answer papers. But if for some reason you do not agree with it and you still want to discuss, you are welcome to send me an email, and then I can also take a look at your answer sheet.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. That will clear my concept more. Okay, sir.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so it is about time that we got started with today's lecture. I have no new announcements to make. We are still working with this company for getting you free licenses for Adams software. I think we will keep you updated, and the sooner we get the permission, the sooner you can install it and so on. We'll have a special class to discuss how to use that software. So I'll just keep you updated on that. Okay. So with that small announcement, I think so homework, the next homework 5, which will deal with multi-body dynamics and so on, I will send it out send it out tomorrow. Okay, I'm sharing the screen now. And are you guys able to see my blank sheet of paper? Can someone kindly let me know?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So we will continue our discussion today on this new tool for coming up with the dynamics of multi-body systems, and that's the Lagrangian formalism. Okay, and in particular, we would focus today on the right-hand side of Euler-Lagrange equations, and that involves generalized forces. What are they? How do we compute them? And so on and so forth. Okay, that's going to be the topic for today's lecture. So, by way of recap, we first motivated ourselves for jumping ship, for searching for an alternate way to formulate the equations of motion for a multi-body system. We noticed how we have to deal with 6n reaction forces or joint forces if there are n joints, and you have to flow through all of them before you can get the overall dynamics relating only the joint variables, dynamics of the multi-body system relating only the joint variables and their velocities and accelerations to the joint forces and torques and so on. That's what we are interested in because that's what we can control, but we could not get there in one shot as a consequence of the recursive algorithm that Newton Euler equations forced us to follow. Okay, so the motivation therefore was provided in the previous lecture. There are too many constraint forces. Okay, so the promise of Lagrangian mechanics was that if I had, for example, 6 joints, which gives me 6 degrees of freedom for my manipulator, instead of writing down 36 equations and then simplifying 36 equations, I will directly be able to write 6 equations. Okay, so the extent of simplification that has happened is staggering. Okay, so it is absolutely of interest to us because of the huge simplification that results in coming up with a dynamic equation for the system. So the downside, however, was that this is a sophisticated body of knowledge. So we do not start from scratch. We do not write down, we do not arrive at Euler-Lagrange equations and so on, starting from Newton's laws, for instance, because that's a separate body of knowledge that requires us to have some mathematical tools which we may not be in possession of now, for example, calculus of variations and so on. So instead, we decided to just focus on a utilitarian approach, only focus on learning those things which are of importance to us, learn how to use them, and then apply them to the problems of interest to us. So I gave the analogy of a cell phone. So if I touch one part of a screen on a cell phone, I can make a call. If I touch another part of the screen, I can access my internet. If I swipe it and go somewhere else, I can do something else. Now, what is behind all of these magical things that a cell phone features possess? That is something that's not of great interest to us, and we are not even equipped to understand the engineering that goes behind all these magical features. But what is important for us is to be able to access internet, be able to make calls to our family, etc., etc. So we learn just that bit which is required for us to execute those activities and then move on. So in a similar manner, we approach Lagrangian mechanics. Although it's a huge body of knowledge, we only pick those aspects of it that are of importance to us from the point of view of solving problems. Okay, so in particular, to demonstrate, to arrive at the dynamic equations of multi-body systems, which is otherwise a very cumbersome procedure. Okay, so therefore, in keeping with that philosophy of top-down approach to Lagrangian formalism, we first defined a lot of things. We first defined what was known as system configuration. Then we talked about generalized coordinates. and then we talked about holonomic and non-holonomic constraints. So some constraints which appear non-holonomic can be, by integration, be reduced to holonomic constraints. So all of these, for example, if you take holonomic constraints, we say okay. So Euler-Lagrange equations look mysterious to us. There were some partial derivatives of this Lagrangian with respect to this generalized coordinates and so on and so forth. And then we also stated that it is valid, applicable only to holonomic systems. Then you can always stop me and ask, wait, why is this holonomic constraint necessary for me to be able to use Euler-Lagrange equations? That's not clear to us, right? This is the problem. This opacity in the logical flow is the disadvantage of top-down approach. But hopefully the price that is waiting for us at the end in terms of the simplicity in dynamics and so on helps us to temporarily forget about these inconsistencies, this breaks in logic, simply accept them for what they are and proceed with applying these equations and these constraints to solve our problems. Okay, so we talked about the advantages of Euler-Lagrange equations. You don't have 6n number of them, but in general you have only n number of them, where n is a number of generalized coordinates in equations. So as I said, this is a way whereby because we are defining the energy, the Lagrangian of a system is the difference between the kinetic and potential energies, and internal forces do not figure in these expressions. So we are therefore able to not have to worry about internal forces. So we only have n equations, and then its generality. So we talked about how we can come up with Lagrangians for non-mechanical systems. So the equivalent of kinetic energy, the equivalent of potential energy can be conceived of even in the electrical domain. We gave the examples of electrical circuits and so on, and that is a testament to the generality of this tool. Newton's laws are applicable only in mechanics. Okay, whereas I have to use maybe Maxwell's equations for electrodynamics. On the other hand, Euler-Lagrange equations gives me a unified framework from which I can independently obtain Maxwell's equations as well as Newton's laws. These will simply be consequences of minimization of a certain functional, as I said, which is called as action. I don't want to get into the physics of that, but that is the advantage of this formalism. Okay, then for us though, what was important was the simplicity that we were getting, and not having not having to deal with internal forces, constraint forces and so on, and to be able to obtain the dynamics in one shot. Okay, and we solved many examples to illustrate how these tools are used as a way to compensate for the lack of transparency in how these equations were arrived at. We therefore applied it to a numerous set of examples to showcase how we can apply these principles. So solved examples, we started from very simple examples such as a mass on a floor and on a frictionless floor, then a pendulum, and then we moved to a pendulum with a moving support. And in all cases, write down the Lagrangian, how to apply the equations, how to write down those equations. The moment you write down the Lagrangian, the rest is all algebra. The rest all reduces to your 12th standard or first year BTech physics or first year BTech mathematics. Just taking partial derivatives and so on and so forth. Okay. The last problem that we considered was not solved in its entirety. So I had considered this problem here of a pendulum whose hinge was moving in the horizontal direction, and we wrote down the velocities along x and y axes, computed the kinetic energy from those velocity expressions. Then the potential energy remained the same as that of a pendulum, a regular pendulum. Then I didn't have time to write down the equations of motion. So we compute the Lagrangian. I'm just showing the steps here. It's all very straightforward algebra, nothing mysterious about it, very straightforward algebra. So I take the partial of L with respect to theta dot, which is my, which is that generalized coordinate. And then I also take the partial of L with respect to theta. I've done that in a stepwise manner here. Then put them all together in the Euler-Lagrange equations, and then I solve them, simplify them to get the expression for the dynamics of the angle theta if the hinge is moving. And if the hinge is moving with an acceleration a, you see that the term a by L appears in the dynamics of the system. And you see here that I did not have to draw free body diagram for this pendulum. If I had to do that, I had to assume normal reactions along x-axis, along y-axis. I had to compute the angular acceleration, I had to compute the centripetal acceleration, etc., etc., and maybe the Coriolis acceleration also, I don't know. So I have to do all of these things, match the x components of the forces to the x components of accelerations, etc., etc. So I have to undertake all of those equations if I were to simply confine myself to Newton-Euler formalism. Okay. Here, however, no reaction forces were introduced. I directly wrote down the expression for energy, which automatically took into account the constraints that exist in this problem, namely that the length L is a constant and the hinge is for constraint to move along the x-axis, etc. And then from that, in one shot, obtain the dynamic equation for the pendulum. Okay, so all these problems were toy examples. I want to give one example which has a real physical significance, which has had some impact in the real world before talking about today's topic, namely generalized forces. So let us take the same problem of the pendulum, okay, but this time let us say the pendulum is inverted. Okay, so instead of the pendulum pointed down, let's say the pendulum is pointed upwards. Okay, I assume that most of you can relate to the fact that this configuration is an unstable configuration. You must have tried to balance a pole, a ruler, or whatever else on your hand, and seen that if you are not careful, this will simply flip over, right? So this is what we mean by stability in a mathematical sense. Is not necessary for us to intuitively understand that this configuration is not stable. If I leave it for some time on its own, it will flip over. Okay. Now suppose, just as I moved the hinge in the previous example along the x-axis, this time I move the hinge along the z-axis. Okay, I jiggle about the point where this pendulum is fixed. Okay, if I were to do that, and if I were to define this angle of departure from the vertical as angle theta, then I get the dynamics. I will not write down the Lagrangian. You can follow the exact same steps as what we did in the previous example. You can find out the x velocity, y velocity in terms of theta and in terms of z, and or I don't know what I have used x, y here probably. So maybe this, if you call this the y-axis and if you call that the x-axis, you can compute the x and y velocities in a very similar manner, and then compute the Lagrange and obtain the equations of motion. The equation of motion will look something like this: theta double dot minus g by L minus of g by L plus z double dot sine theta is equal to 0. Okay, so in the previous example, you got cos theta because the acceleration was along the x-axis. Here you get sine theta multiplying the acceleration term here because of motion, acceleration is along the z-axis. Okay, now if I were to move this z in a sinusoidal manner, okay, so if I were to provide z is equal to z naught sine omega t, let us say, as my input jiggling that I provide to the hinge of my pendulum, then the equation will look something like theta double dot minus g by L plus z naught omega square with some constant sine omega t, maybe minus, doesn't matter, these signs are not very important, sine theta is equal to 0. Okay, in the limit that theta is very small, so when the so for small displacements about that vertical position of that pendulum, the equation I can linearize, I can replace sine theta with theta, because for small angles sine theta is approximately equal to theta, and I would get an equation something of this kind, minus G by L minus Z naught omega square sine omega t times theta equal to 0. Okay. Now, if you notice here, the coefficient of theta is a function of time. Okay. So this is what is known as a parametric oscillator. Why is it called a parametric oscillator? It's because the parameter. So in a differential equation, you have parameters and you have variables, right? You have coefficients and you have variables. This is a parameter. This is not a variable. The variable is theta here. The parameter itself is oscillating. It's changing. Okay. So it's called as a parametric oscillator. So this, kind of a system, where you have parametric oscillation, can be used to stabilize these kinds of unstable systems. Okay. If I were to choose the right kind of frequency omega for moving up and down, it turns out that this vertical configuration will actually end up becoming a stable configuration for the pendulum. It is very counterintuitive, where if anyone who has tried to balance a pole on his hand or her hand knows that after some time the pole is going to fall down unless you're constantly correcting for it by using feedback. Your hand as a actuator and you're constantly correcting for the position, it will fall down. But here, even though you don't have that corrective action, you're just moving this up and down, the fulcrum, the hinge up and down at a certain frequency. It turns out that you can maintain this pendulum in its vertical configuration. It becomes a stable system. Okay. It will not fall off. Even if you displace it a little bit, it will come back to the vertical configuration. So such a pendulum is called as a Kapitsa pendulum. So Kapitsa was a famous Russian physicist. Probably is also a Nobel laureate. And this principle of stabilizing a physical system by providing the sinusoidally changing parametric term has profound implications in other areas of physics. For example, in electrodynamics, it can be shown that it is not possible to stably trap a charged particle using a static set of electric fields. Okay, there is a famous theorem called Earnshaw's theorem which prevents that from happening. So in other words, if I have a set of capacitor plates, I cannot stably position an electron in this set of capacitor plates. Even though at some point there may be an equilibrium point, if I displace the electron a little bit, it will go away. It will go and attach itself to one of the capacitor plates. Okay. However, if I provide, so this instability therefore of that electron about its equilibrium position is analogous to the instability of this pendulum here. Okay. But if I provide a time varying electric field, which is analogous to providing this parametric excitation term, it is possible to stably trap that electron there or to stably trap an ion there. Okay. So this principle of providing time varying parameters to stably trap ions is what is used in what is known as ion traps. Okay, you stably trap ions, and by using this parametric excitation, a scientist by name Wolfgang Paul trapped ions and won the Nobel Prize, because you can do very precise experiments with ions that have been trapped using this principle. Similarly, some years later, other physicists figured out how to trap neutral atoms instead of ions, this time not by using electric fields but by using magnetic fields. Okay, so all atoms also have a small magnetic moment. Okay, so this magnetic moment was used to stably trap neutral atoms, and that stable trapping of neutral atoms paved the way for what is known as Bose-Einstein condensation. Okay, it's a new form of matter which exists at temperatures close to 0 Kelvin, and that it was predicted by an Indian physicist by name Satyendranath Bose along with Einstein, and it was very challenging to realize that matter. And this way of trapping neutral atoms enabled realization of that new form of matter, and that too won the Nobel Prize. Okay, so this equation therefore has had profound implications on our understanding of the world around us. It may look like a simple mathematical equation, a second order differential equation with time varying coefficients, but when applied to different physical systems, it has the potential to change the way those fields of physics develop. Okay, so just wanted to give some example of a concrete example of how these equations could be of use in practice. Any questions so far? Okay, so now let us move on to today's lecture, and that has to do with discussion on generalized forces. Okay, so I shall write down the Euler-Lagrange equations once again. So the equation that I wrote in the previous lecture was d by dt of delta L by delta Q dot. If we are talking about the ith generalized coordinate, I'll have Qi subscript I. So this is just a scalar equation, minus delta L by delta Qi is equal to capital Qi, where we called capital Qi as the generalized force. We did not discuss anything more about the so-called generalized force in the previous lecture. We focused only on examples where this right-hand side was 0. So we didn't have to worry about it. Now let us bite this bullet. Let us try to understand what this generalized force is. Okay, so I shall write down the definition once again in keeping with the way we have been developing this subject all along. I shall simply directly define what a generalized force is, and then take numerous examples to illustrate how generalized forces might appear for specific problems. The generalized force Qi is one that does the same virtual work upon providing a virtual displacement delta Qi, okay, as the virtual work done by the set of forces, set of actual forces and moments acting on the system. Okay, so this is the definition. What this means is the following. So suppose I have my system. It could be a collection of particles, or it could be a collection of or a single rigid body itself, and so on and so forth. I can use, let us say, Q is the generalized coordinate that I use to describe the configuration of this set of rigid bodies, assuming that we have only 1 degree of freedom, for example. For now, we'll just consider that. Okay. Let us say this is acted upon by any number of forces, F1 and F2 and so on, Fn. There could also be moments acting on this. Okay, so there might be moment M1, moment M2, all of those things. Now the position of the force, the location where the force F1 is applied is, let me call it as P1, and the force where the point where F2 is applied, let me call that P2, and so on and so forth up to Pn. And I can also call similar, I don't want to define positions for the moments. I will get to what I will use there in a moment. Okay, so suppose I were to change this generalized coordinate Q by some small amount, provide a virtual displacement delta Q. You must have come across the notion of virtual work in your undergrad. It is often used to solve problems in statics. Sometimes it's also used in strength of materials in the form of Castigliano's theorem to again solve problems in deformation of elastic structures and so on and so forth. Okay, the same principle is being used here. I will not get into the details of that principle. I'm assuming you know the principle of virtual work. So suppose I provide a virtual displacement delta Q. Okay, that virtual displacement, it could be a small change in angle or small change in displacement or whatever. Let us say that changes the position vector P1 by a small amount delta P1. Okay, and position vector P2 by a small amount delta P2, and so on and so forth. Okay, what is the work done as a consequence of the change in position? Work done is that force F1 dot delta P1, right? What is the work done because of that virtual displacement delta P2? That will be the force acting at that point dot the displacement, virtual displacement of that point. Similarly, if I have some moment m1 and my change of this generalized coordinate delta q, let us say, results in a certain angular change delta theta 1 at this point, then the work done will be the moment m dot the delta theta vector. So there may be changes about multiple angles. So m dot delta theta would be the work done because of all those changes. Okay. So similarly, I compute the net virtual work done as a consequence of having provided this delta q, delta p1, delta p2, everything changed as a consequence of this change in the generalized coordinate delta q, and that net work done, net virtual work done, I write that as the actual change in the generalized coordinate times this generalized force. Okay, so by definition, therefore, this generalized force is one that ends up doing the same work as the net work done by all the other forces, same virtual work as the work done by all the other forces and moments acting on the system. Okay, so it's based on energy. Okay, the definition of virtual work is therefore based on energy. Any questions about the definition? It looks abstract. I think if the more examples we take to illustrate what form the virtual work takes in different problems, the more comfortable you will get with it. Okay, this is the definition. So I can actually put delta q on the left hand side, and I can simply write q, the virtual work, as f1 times f1 dot partial of p1 with respect to q, if I have only one generalized coordinate, plus f2 dot partial of p2 with respect to q, etc., etc. Okay, so this is the expression. Now, if I have n generalized coordinates, then for each generalized coordinate I will have a certain generalized force qi, and I can obtain that expression for qi from this particular expression here. I just need to put subscript to the generalized coordinate, make it small qi, and capital Qi would be the corresponding generalized force. Okay, so this, as I said, I don't want to take too many questions on this here because it looks abstract. The moment we start to solve problems, what qi looks for different problems will naturally become apparent to you, and then you will feel that is a very easy concept to internalize. Okay, so let us therefore take up problems and see how qi appears in various scenarios, starting from the simplest problem of a block sitting on a floor. So I have this block here, and let us say I'm applying a force F along the horizontal direction. We know that the Lagrangian for this is half m x dot square. There is no potential energy for this mass. So x is the location of the center of this block away from some arbitrary coordinate frame that to this problem. Okay, we know that the equation will be mx double dot will be equal to qx. That will be the kind of equation. What is qx? That's the question that we need to answer. So what is the generalized coordinate here? There's only one generalized coordinate, q, and that's the x position of this mass, right? So suppose I provide a small virtual displacement delta x to this mass. What is the work done? Virtual work done. You can see that it's equal to f times delta x. Okay, and that therefore is going to be equal to that same, the generalized coordinate qx times that change in the the generalized force qx times the change in the generalized coordinate, which is delta q, and since q has been chosen to be equal to x, is going to be equal to simply qx times x, delta x. Okay, so therefore you see that for this particular problem, the expression for Qx is very simple. Qx will simply be the force itself. So the so-called generalized force in this problem is nothing but the horizontal force that I might be applying on the mass. Okay, so this is how I would apply principle, this general principle I talked about here to this specific problem. Let us take a slightly more challenging problem and see how the generalized force looks like. So let us now take the case of a pendulum. Okay, so I have a pendulum, and let us say there's a massless rigid rod, and the bob here has a mass m, and this angle here is theta. So as with the the example that we considered in the previous class, we shall assume that our generalized coordinate is theta. Okay, let us say that there is a force F0, horizontal force F0 acting on this mass. The question now is, this could be a function of time, it could be a constant, that is irrelevant, but it's always in the horizontal direction. The question is, what is the equation of motion for a pendulum that is acted upon by a horizontal force? Okay, that is the thing. So let us do it in a very systematic manner. So I have the generalized coordinate. I know what the kinetic energy will be. It will be half m L theta dot the whole square, which is half m L square theta dot square, right, where L is the length of this pendulum. And the potential energy we know is mg times 1 mg L times 1 minus cos theta. That's the potential energy. So when we put that in the expression for this kinetic energy, so Lagrangian is T minus V. So when we write the Euler-Lagrange equation, we get theta double dot plus m, I think I got ml square theta double dot plus mgl times sine theta is equal to qx. And if qx were equal to 0, this I can cancel out m and I can remove one of the l's and I can get the expression that I had in the previous lecture. Otherwise, if I faithfully simply simplify the Euler-Lagrange equation, this is what I'm going to get. So qx is a generalized force. Okay, what is a generalized force in this particular example? Let us go by just a definition. If I provide a virtual displacement to the generalized coordinate delta q, which in this case is delta theta, right? The work done would be by definition qx times delta q. Okay, or in other words, qx times delta theta. That is by definition, the net work done would be given by the generalized force times the change in that generalized coordinate. So if I provide a small delta theta, a virtual displacement delta theta to the configuration of this pendulum, what is the work done by the external force? What is the work done by F0? Let us compute that. Okay, what is F0, by the way? That force F, it has a component along the x-axis and no component along the z-axis. So F0 vector will look something like that, right? Now, what is the position vector of this mass? The position vector of that mass, I'll call that P1, okay, is equal to minus L. The x component is L sine theta. The y component, if I choose this as the origin, this is x and this is y, let us say, and I choose the location of the hinge as the origin, then the position vector of that mass is L sine theta, that's the x component. The y component is minus L cos theta, right? So if I provide therefore a small change, virtual displacement delta theta, what will delta P1 be? Delta P1 from this expression, it is equal to L cos theta delta theta. Then this is L sine theta delta theta, right? So therefore, delta P1 is L cos theta, L sine theta times delta theta. That is the virtual displacement that has occurred because of this change in the virtual, because of this virtual displacement of the generalized coordinate. Correct? What is the work done because of this virtual displacement? I have this force and I have the displacement. Okay. What is the work done by the force on account of this displacement that has happened to the mass? Okay. The work done is F, the force F naught dot producted with the displacement vector delta P1. Right. So I will therefore, you know that this is nothing but F naught transpose delta P1 in the language of matrices, and it's the product of the x components plus the product of the y components. What do I get that to be? I get that to be equal to F naught L cos theta, which is the product of the x components of displacement times delta theta, of course, plus the y component of force is 0, so that product will become 0. So the net work done is therefore F naught L cos theta delta theta. Okay, this by definition is Q. I don't want to call this Qx, Q theta, because this generalized coordinate is theta. So this is Q theta times delta theta. Right. So therefore, what is the generalized force Q theta? From this equation, it is clear that Q theta is F naught times L cos theta. Any questions about this procedure? Okay, I'm happy to see that there are no questions, but I want to make a couple of important comments. Okay, we call this a generalized force, but does this guy have the units of force? What is the unit of this term here? F naught L cos theta. It is Newton meter, right? It has the units of torque. So the generalized force, therefore, need not have the same units as force. And this is sort of analogous to how a generalized coordinate need not have the same units as a Cartesian coordinate. A Cartesian coordinate always has the units of meter length, right? Whereas a generalized coordinate could be an angle theta. In the case of electrical circuits, the generalized coordinate was charge. Its units was Coulomb. Okay. So similarly, this generalized force here need not have the units of Newton. It can have the units of Newton meter. What is important, however, is that generalized force times the generalized coordinate, that product should always have the units of work, okay, joules. That should always be the case. So if the generalized coordinate here has units of radian, as it is in this particular example, the generalized force will therefore have to have the units of Newton meter, so that the product has the units of work, namely joule. Okay, so Q theta therefore is not necessarily a force, and it is not necessarily directly this force F naught either. You see that there are so many other things. There is some geometric parameter cos theta also that is coming into the expression for Q theta. Okay, so the expression therefore for the angular dynamics would be that this is, I shouldn't have called this Qx, I'm sorry. This is Q theta, and it's equal to F naught L cos theta. Okay, so any questions about how we obtain the generalized force for this particular example? Okay, excellent. Now let us take one more example, and to further clarify how one goes about deriving generalized forces. So this is the example of a slider. On top of the slider, I have a mass. Okay, I'll call the mass M1, and connected to that mass is a pendulum. Okay, the rod is massless because I have not yet discussed rigid body, Lagrangian for rigid bodies and so on. I'm not. These are all point masses for the moment, and this bob has a mass M2. Okay, so let us say I have a force F1 acting on this mass M1, this collar M1 of mass M1, and I have a torque tau, acting at this revolute joint. There's a torque tau acting at a revolute joint. Maybe I will call it tau 1. Okay, and then I have another force. In this case, I will probably pick a vertical force because I had applied a horizontal force to my previous pendulum. I'll apply a vertical force, this to this pendulum, the vertical force is F2. Okay, so what are the generalized forces for this particular problem? The generalized forces depend on the generalized coordinates that you pick. What generalized coordinates can we pick? We could pick the x component of the mass m1 and the xy components of the mass m2 as the three generalized coordinates, but then the xy components of the mass m2 are going to be constrained. They are not going to be independent because the length of this pendulum bob is fixed. So instead, for the sake of convenience, I pick the x coordinate of the mass m1 and the angle theta as the generalized coordinates for this problem. Okay, because between them they completely define the configuration of this combination of this interconnection of masses. Okay. So for this example, in the previous class, I think I had written down the Lagrangian. If not, I can write it down here. So what is the kinetic energy of that mass m1? It is just half m1 x dot square. Okay. And what is the kinetic energy of the mass m2? I should compute its vertical velocity, horizontal velocity, and then take the sum of their squares. What is the vertical velocity and what is the horizontal velocity of m2? I can get that from the vertical and horizontal positions. So the vertical position, let's say I'll call it as P2y, will be equal to minus L cos theta. Okay, if I choose the origin somewhere there. Okay, this is x-axis, this is y-axis. Okay, what is the x position of the mass m2, P2x? It's going to be equal to x plus L sine theta. Right? So what is the vertical velocity, P2y dot? That's going to be equal to L sine theta, theta dot. Right? What is the horizontal velocity, P2x dot? It's going to be equal to x dot plus L cos theta, theta dot. I've just used chain rule to differentiate these two expressions. That's it. So what is the kinetic energy of the mass m2 therefore? It's equal to half m2 times the x velocity square plus the y velocity square, which is x dot plus L cos theta, theta dot the square plus L sine theta, theta dot the whole square. That is the expression for the kinetic energy. I have to add this to the first expression, half m1 x dot square. This is the kinetic energy of the system. Okay, what is the potential energy of mass m1? Moves in the horizontal plane, so there's no potential energy associated with that if we choose this as the datum. The potential energy for this mass m2, it depends on what we choose as the datum. Okay, if I choose the origin of this coordinate system as a datum, then the potential energy of the mass m2 will be m2 times L cos theta with a minus sign, right? Because it is below the below the origin. It's along the negative y-axis. So from this, I can get the Lagrangian to be T minus V, and I can then obtain the Euler-Lagrange equations. So Abhishek Panchal has a question.
Sir, there should be a M2GL cos theta, no?
Pardon me?
Sir, M2GL cos theta.
Oh, M2G. Sorry. You are right. I'm very sorry. M2G. G had to be there. I'm sorry. Correct. Okay. Now, what are the constraint forces? So how many equations will be there? If I were to, how many generalized coordinates are there? There are two generalized coordinates, x and theta. And for each generalized coordinate, I'll have one Euler-Lagrange equation. So therefore, I will have two Euler-Lagrange equations. So I will have d by dt of delta L by delta x minus delta L by delta x dot divided minus delta L by delta x is equal to the generalized force along that particular generalized coordinate, which I call qx. And then there will be the other equation d by dt of delta L by delta theta dot minus delta L by delta theta is equal to q theta, which is a generalized force along the theta coordinate. Okay, what is the expression for qx and q theta in terms of the physical forces that this system is experiencing. Let us blindly go by the definition of, let us start with Qx. What is Qx? If I provide a virtual displacement delta x to the system, what is the net work done by all the different physical forces that the system is experiencing? So if I provide a virtual displacement delta x, what is the net work done by the force F1? It is just F1 times delta x, right? Likewise, what is the work done by the torque tau? If I change that position delta x alone while keeping theta fixed, okay, the angle theta has not changed. Therefore, the torque tau does not do any work. Okay, so that work done is 0. What is the work done by the force F2? Let us look at this diagram here. F2 is in the downward direction, and virtual displacement is being provided in the horizontal direction, right? So the dot product of the displacement with the force will therefore be equal to 0 for this particular problem. If F2 had a x component, then the dot product will not be 0. Otherwise, in this particular case, that x component is 0. Therefore, the work done by the force F2, the virtual work done due to the virtual displacement delta x, will be also be equal to 0. So the third work done will also be equal to 0. Therefore, the expression for this is net work done, net virtual work done, and that should be equal to that work, generalized force Qx times the generalized displacement delta x that I have provided already. Okay, so from this I get that the first expression for Qx is simply equal to F1. Any questions about this derivation? Okay, now the second force Q theta, the second generalized force Q theta, is slightly more tricky. Okay, the question we are asking now is, suppose I keep x fixed in this problem and I provide a virtual displacement to the second generalized coordinate. In this case, it is theta. I provide a displacement delta theta to that second generalized coordinate. Then by definition, Q theta times delta theta is going to be the work done. Okay. Now that should be equal to the net work done by all the forces, actual forces that are acting on our system. What is the work done by all these different forces? When I change this angle theta by delta theta, what is the work done by the force F1? Do you agree with me that it is 0? Because for F1 to do some work, I should change the location of that mass M1. But this angle delta theta doesn't change the location of the mass M1. So the work done by the force F1 will be 0. So I'll have 0 as the work done by the force F1. What about the work done by this torque tau1 that is acting? When I provide this angle delta theta, the work done by the torque tau1 this time is not 0. Instead, it is what? It is tau1 times delta theta. Okay. Plus, what about the work done by this force F2? Okay. So when I provide this delta theta, my displacement will be in this particular direction, right? It will be tangential to the radius vector. So what is the position P2? Again, we have written down the location P2y and P2x, right? So therefore, I know that since I know that P2, the location of the second mass, is given by minus L cos theta and x plus L sin theta and minus L cos theta. That's the location. So delta P2 due to delta theta alone is equal to simply L cos theta delta theta, and here it will be L sin theta delta theta. That will be the virtual displacement of that mass due to delta theta alone. Okay, so what is the work done? I know that my force F here, the force F2 vector, is aligned along the negative y-axis. So it will be of the kind 0, comma F2. Okay, so the work done will be the dot product of these two terms, and which is going to be therefore equal to, the first term is 0 here. So the second term is F2 times L sin theta. L sin theta delta theta. Okay, so the net work done therefore is tau1 delta theta plus F2 L sin theta delta theta, and by the definition, this is equal to the generalized force Q theta times that displacement in the generalized coordinate, virtual displacement that I have provided. And from this I get the expression. Yes.
It should be minus F2, na? In negative direction.
Well, it depends on how you define F2. If F2 itself is a negative number, I can still keep it this way. It doesn't matter. If you want minus F2, we can have minus F2. It's not an issue. Doesn't matter. Okay.
Okay.
It depends on the sign of F2 basically here. If I say F2 is equal to minus 5, then already it's okay. So whether it is plus or I'll just keep with plus. Okay. So this is the expression. So what is the expression for Q theta therefore? You see that it is nothing but tau 1 plus F2L sine theta. Okay. So I provided this virtual displacement delta theta and then computed how much work is done because of the virtual displacement, and that work done should be equal to the work done by the generalized force due to that virtual displacement in the generalized coordinate. In this case, it is delta theta. Okay, so that gives me Q theta. So this is therefore going to be the equations, set of equations that give me the dynamics of my system. Any questions about this? Okay, no questions. I'm very happy to know that you guys have very quickly grasped the meaning of a generalized force. Okay, so the last example I would give is for a 4-bar mechanism. Okay, so let us say I have this 4-bar mechanism here. Let us say I take this as joint angle theta 1, and this is joint angle theta 2, this joint angle theta 3, and this joint angle theta 4. Okay, let us say this is the first joint, this is the second joint, the third joint, this is the fourth joint, right? Let us say at the second joint, I have some force F2 that is acting on my 4-bar mechanism, and there is a torque also, which is M2, which is acting on the 4-bar mechanism. At the third joint, there's a force F3 that's acting on it, and it need not act exactly at the joint. It can act at some other location also, but it's easier if I write it this way. And if I take this particular example, let us say there is a moment M3 also that's acting on it. Now, how many degrees of freedom does this 4-bar mechanism have? It just has 1 degree of freedom, right? If I pick theta 1 as my generalized coordinate, okay, all other angles get fixed by this choice of the generalized coordinate. Okay. Now, if I provide a small virtual displacement delta q, or in other words delta theta 1, then if I know the kinematics of this problem, in other words, if I know the length of this and the relative angles and so on, I will be able to write down how much change delta theta 2 there was due to the change delta theta 1, how much change was there in the third angle, how much change was there in the fourth angle. Okay. Likewise, I will also be able to write down how much change there was in the position vector of that second joint, and how much change there was in the position vector of the third joint, if I know how much change there was in the angle theta 1, right? Because it's a 1 degree of freedom thing. If I specify theta 1 and provide a small perturbation to it, I can predict how much displacement, virtual displacement and virtual angle change there will be all over, right? So if I know these pieces of information, I can compute the net work done. Okay, so the net work done therefore will be equal to the force F2 dot producted with the virtual displacement delta P2, and delta P2 you notice will be a function of delta theta 1 because it's a 1 degree of freedom system. If I specify delta theta 1, everything else gets fixed, plus F3 times dot producted with delta P3, okay, plus M2 times delta theta 2, because that's the work done due to the change delta theta 2, plus M3 times delta theta 3, and that's going to be equal to that Q theta 1, which is the generalized force associated with that coordinate theta 1 times delta theta 1, right? In other words, therefore, the generalized force in this particular case will be equal to F2 times dot product with delta P2, or maybe I'll write it better, partial of P2 with respect to theta 1, okay, plus F3 dot producted with partial of P3 with respect to theta 1, plus M2 dot producted with partial of theta 2 with respect, I don't need to take a dot product here, but because M2 is anyway out of the plane of the paper, delta theta 2 by delta theta 1 plus M3 delta theta 3 by delta theta 1. Let us say I had an additional moment M1 also here, which is acting at the first joint. I will. Hello, you cannot see, is it? Sorry. Is this okay? Yeah. So I will have M1 times delta theta 1 by delta theta 1, which is going to be equal to 1. Okay. So I'll have M1 plus all these terms. All these terms, delta theta 3 by delta theta 1, delta P2 by delta theta 1, everything can be evaluated from the geometry of the 4-bar mechanism. Okay. So this will give me the generalized force for the particular coordinate. Any questions?
Sir, in the previous pendulum problem,
yes,
if we give both theta and x displacement simultaneously, in that case?
No, the whole point of the whole procedure for computing the generalized force along a certain generalized coordinate is to provide a virtual displacement to that coordinate alone. Okay. If you provide both, you will get a bigger term for a work done, but that's not useful from the point of view of deriving the generalized forces. Okay. So to derive the generalized force along a certain generalized coordinate, you provide a virtual displacement to the generalized coordinate, and then compute the net work done by the system of forces and moments that are acting on your system, and from that you equate that to the generalized force times that virtual displacement. Okay. That's how you derive it. Okay. So one thing to note in this expression here is that although the generalized force is with respect to theta 1, the expression for that includes forces F2, F3, M2, M3, none of which are directly acting at the first joint. Okay. So that's another counterintuitive fact. Just as the generalized force need not have the units of Newton, likewise, the generalized force need not be associated with just the first joint alone. Okay, it's not going to be just M1 alone. Okay, the generalized force will also have components of F2, M2, F3, M3, and so on and so forth. Why? Simply because the definition of a generalized force is from the basis of virtual work. So if I change that first variable, all these other forces and moments also end up doing work, and therefore they also end up appearing in the expression for the generalized force. So this is one slightly counterintuitive concept that is worth keeping in mind. Okay. Abhishek Panchal has a question.
Sir, if we have more than 1 degrees of freedom and other angles are dependent on both of them, then we include one of the degree of freedom in this expression of actual work, or we just include only dependent angles and forces.
If there are 2 degrees of freedom, there will be 2 generalized coordinates in the proper set, right? So yes. You at any point in time you change only one of them, okay, and then you compute the forces due to change in just that one generalized coordinate. Okay, so there is no difference in the treatment of multi-degree of freedom systems. In fact, the mass pendulum problem that we looked at in the previous example was a 2 degree of freedom system, right? I could independently move the mass M1 along the slider and move the pendulum by an angle theta about that mass, okay? M2 could be rotated about the first mass independently. So that was a 2 degree of freedom system. And if you saw how we went about obtaining the generalized forces along those 2 generalized coordinates, when we are computing the first one, we keep the other one fixed. When we're computing the second one, we keep the first one fixed. So that's it. Okay, the same approach can be adopted even for the more general problem that you talked about.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Okay. Yeah. So I have given you examples of to illustrate how one computes the generalized forces, and then therefore that helps you obtain the equations of motion for a system that has external forces acting on it. Okay. The next concept in connection with forces, in connection with what we have on the left hand, on the right hand side, are the forces of constraint. Okay. The whole purpose of launching onto this bandwagon, jumping onto this bandwagon, was because we wanted to be able to get rid of forces of constraint, the reaction forces. Okay. But under some circumstances, it makes sense for us to be able to know what those reaction forces are. For example, these reaction forces might apply stresses on the joints, and those stresses might end up fracturing the joint if the stresses are too high. So therefore, it is, even though we might not want their presence from the point of view of kinematics and so on, from the point of view of stress analysis, they may be necessary, right? So there is always, therefore, some motivation for us to not completely do away with the constraint forces. It's good that we can do away with them. That allows us to directly obtain the equations of motion without writing down the reaction forces, without calculating accelerations, and so on and so forth. But it will be good if we also have the ability to calculate them if we wish to do so. Okay. So what I would discuss now is how we can calculate the forces of constraint in the Lagrangian formalism. Okay. Again, the approach would be to state the principle. So it will be like a mantra, right? I will say, you do this, you do that, you do the third thing. It will all look very mysterious as it has so far appeared every time I define something new. But then we will take concrete examples to showcase how we apply those apparently mysterious principles. That's how we are going to adopt. That's what we are going to do. Okay. So how to compute forces of constraint? So generally, you have a few constraint equations, okay, and those constraint equations are enforced by the forces of constraint. For example, if you take a pendulum, okay, this pendulum, is, if the length L is fixed, then the distance of the bob from the center of rotation is going to stay fixed. So if I pick, therefore, x and y positions of this bob as the two generalized coordinates, there is a relationship, a constraint relationship between them, namely that x square plus y square has to be equal to L square, right? What is a constraint force? A constraint force is that force which ensures that this particular geometric constraint is met. In this case, that constraint force will be a kind of tension in the massless rod, which applies such a clearly calculated value or magnitude to the mass that it always gets the mass to move along a circular trajectory, centered at the the revolute joint there. Okay, so this force, therefore, the tension in the rod is therefore a constraint force because it constrains, it enforces the constraint that we have here, the geometric constraint that you have here. Okay, as you can see, this constraint is a holonomic constraint because it is a function of only the values of the two generalized coordinates x and y and not their derivatives. So I can write this constraint equation as x square plus y square minus L square equal to 0. Okay, so let us say this is a specific example of a pendulum. I can have other constraint equations. I will have constraint equations for a 4-bar mechanism also, right? If I pick θ1, I will have constraint equations for θ2, θ3, θ4, and all of those things. So there will be 3 constraint equations there, right? So in general, I will have constraint equations to be of the form some function of the joint of the generalized coordinates q1, q2, etc., and also maybe time is equal to 0. Okay, so we took the example of a pendulum whose that fulcrum was moving, right? That not fulcrum, sorry, that revolute joint was moving in the x-axis. So there we saw that the constraint on the generalized coordinate was that x of t was equal to half at square. Or in other words, x minus half at square is equal to 0. So this is another kind of constraint. Here you see that the generalized coordinate x is minus half at square is equal to 0. It's another algebraic equation in x, and therefore it also is of the same form as what I have written here. Okay, so f of q1 comma q2 comma whatever comma t is equal to 0. So this is the general form of a single constraint. Okay, in this case, that f is equal to x square plus y square minus l square. In the other case, it's equal to x minus half at square. It can take different forms depending on the problem that we are confronted with. Now, there are forces that impose this constraint. Okay, how do we compute those forces? In other words, there is a tension here that imposes this constraint that the bob moves about in a circular trajectory. How do we compute that? Or if this the revolute joint is accelerating along the x-axis, there's a force that I'm applying to get that acceleration to happen. What is that force? How do we compute it within the framework of Lagrangian formalism? That's the question that we are trying to answer. And here is the mantra. Here is a set of steps that allows us to do it. Okay. First, of course, compute the Lagrangian. L equal to t minus v. Okay. Then the second thing is, okay, choose. Let me define a new Lagrangian okay, which is defined as L prime equal to L plus lambda f, where lambda is called as the Lagrange multiplier. Okay. The third step is treat lambda as another generalized coordinate. And obtain the Euler-Lagrange equations for this coordinate as well, along with the others. Okay. Finally, so when you obtain those equations, from those equations, you can obtain an expression for lambda. Okay. Then the generalized force associated with that constraint is given by Q is equal to, okay, the generalized force along the the jth generalized coordinate is just a moment, is given by sigma lambda, there is no sigma here, lambda delta f by delta qj. Okay, so you have j, you have n generalized coordinates. If I take the partial of f with respect to any one of them and multiply that with lambda, I get the corresponding generalized force along that direction, which imposes the constraint. Okay, these generalized forces impose constraints, right? So the constraint force is obtained from this expression. Okay, so maybe I will lift this up a little bit so that all the 4 steps are visible to you. Okay, so if you look at this recipe that I have provided to you, if I were you, for example, if I was a student who was looking at all of this, the first question that will occur to me is, what on earth is a Lagrange multiplier? Okay, what on earth, how on earth did you get this particular expression for the generalized force? I don't see how, by defining this modified Lagrangian, why did you define the modified Lagrangian in this manner? Having defined it, how will you end up with this particular expression for generalized force? What is the physical, how do I intuitively understand all of this? So these are the kind of questions that would come to me if I were a student. Okay, and this has been presented therefore without adequate motivation, without adequate physical intuition. After all, we are engineers. We don't want to simply do mathematics. We want to have some feel for the equations that we write. So all these equations therefore are violating all of those golden ways of learning a subject, right? So if I were a student, I would hate an instructor like myself in some sense, because this is not the way a subject ought to be presented, because it is devoid of logic and flow. Okay, to address a student of that kind who would stand up now and ask, why on earth are you doing all these things, Jayant? I don't understand. All of a sudden, out of the blue, you brought in this new variable called lambda, and then you defined this new Lagrangian, and then you defined a new generalized force, and you are telling me like a like a fortune teller, without any rhyme or rhythm. You are telling me, take it. This is the generalized force. Go home now. You have got what you wanted. So that's the way you are telling me all of this. Why should I believe you? How do I know all of these are right? How can I relate to these things at some physical level and not just as a mathematical algorithm? So if a student were to get up and ask me such a question, I would have to say that if you really want to understand how these things came about, okay, it is possible, but not in the kind of time we have available in this course. Okay, it requires you to be familiar with a separate machinery, a mathematical machinery, and that machinery is a machinery of calculus of variations. Okay, I assume that very few of you or none of you have had courses on calculus of variations. If you had those courses, then you would recognize this Lagrange multiplier as a term that comes up in connection with constrained optimization. So if I want to optimize some functional, the term, but there are some constraints that what is being optimized has to satisfy, then I invent this new form which is called as a Lagrange, new Lagrangian, and then solve the problem. So this approach therefore fits in very well with the more general approach of optimizing under constraints. Okay. Unfortunately, you do not have the background necessary to understand that, and I do not use it regularly. I have taken courses on optimization and constrained optimization, but I don't use it in my everyday research. Okay, so I'm not so familiar with it that I can easily describe to you, why these things have to be the way they are. Okay, so the answer to such a student would be, well, these look mysterious. I apologize for introducing them out of the blue, but they're useful. Okay, so let us just learn how to apply them and move on. If you are more curious about why they are defined the way they are, you need to take a step back, read up a little bit of calculus of variations, and then understand how these derivations come about in, how these definitions come about naturally as a consequence of the derivations, the optimization that we would undertake subject to constraints. Okay, that unfortunately is outside the scope of this course, and hence I need to, with your permission and with an apology, I directly present these results without further justification. The only thing we would do now is try to apply them to concrete examples and see how they can be used in practice to derive the joint forces. Okay, so let us do that. Let us do it first for the case of a block which is on a floor, which is the simplest example that we have been considering all the while. Okay, let me do that for that case. Any questions about whatever I discussed so far, and the basis for simply putting down these in a very mechanical algorithmic manner? I'm not proud of discussing them without motivation, but as I said, if we keep our eyes on the prize, which is to simply obtain a simple set of equations without internal forces and so on, then this is something that we simply accept and go forward with. That's it. Okay, so let us take the example of this mass on a floor. Okay, let us say I want the reaction force, this normal reaction. Of course, you guys know the answer to that. Okay, if I have mg acting here, then the normal reaction is also equal to mg, but in the opposite direction. But let us say I have to derive it using the Lagrangian formalism. Then I write down the kinetic energy. So this is x, and this is y-axis, is x-axis. Okay, the kinetic energy, I treat x and y as two independent variables. In the previous Lagrangians, I did not consider y, but now I bring that also in. Okay, I write half m x dot square plus y dot square. That's the kinetic energy, and the potential energy is 0. Okay, subject to the constraint that the y coordinate of the block is at a constant position. Okay, I can even choose that constant position to be equal to 0. Okay, so what is my f of y in this particular f of q? My q is equal to x comma y. Q1 is x, q2 is y. I have two generalized coordinates here. F of q, q1 comma q2 is equal to q2 itself. It's just equal to y, right? So I choose my Lagrangian. Therefore, my new Lagrangian to be equal to the actual Lagrangian, half mx dot square plus y dot square plus lambda times f, lambda times q2, which is lambda times y. Okay, now I apply the Euler-Lagrange equations. Okay, so I have delta L prime by delta x dot to be equal to m x dot. So delta L prime by delta x dot d by dt of that is equal to mx double dot. Okay, similarly delta L prime by delta y dot is equal to my dot. So d by dt of delta L prime by delta y dot is equal to my double dot. Okay, now delta L prime by delta x is equal to 0 because it's not dependent on x. Partial of L prime with respect to y, on the other hand, is equal to lambda, right? Because I have lambda y here. So I would have, therefore, that the equation for along one generalized coordinate, namely the x coordinate, will be mx double dot plus 0 is equal to, there are no forces acting on this mass in this problem, right? It's equal to 0, which is what we expect. The second equation is my double dot plus the other term is lambda, and we have minus of delta L by delta Q2, right? That's so therefore I'll have minus lambda is equal to, oh, sorry. The potential energy is not 0. If I choose y as a generalized coordinate, then the potential energy will be equal to mgy, right? It's not 0, sorry. I have assumed for a moment that the floor does not exist, and I assume that it is possible to change the other generalized coordinate y as well, and therefore I write the potential energy as mgy. Okay, so therefore I would have delta L by delta y prime to be equal to lambda plus mg. Okay, so therefore I would have minus lambda minus mg to be equal to 0. That will be the second equation. The third equation, as we said, we have to treat lambda also as a generalized coordinate. So that will be the new generalized coordinate. And for that, delta L prime by delta lambda dot is equal to 0, right? Because there's no lambda dot represented in the Lagrangian. Delta L prime by delta lambda is equal to y. So therefore, I would have d by dt of delta L prime by delta lambda dot minus delta L prime by delta lambda equal to 0 implies y is equal to 0. We get back the original constraint that we had earlier. Okay. So now I have these two equations, mx double dot equal to 0, my double dot minus mg minus lambda equal to 0. Okay, and I have the third equation, namely y equal to 0. If y is equal to 0, you agree that y double dot is also equal to 0, right? So if y double dot is equal to 0, I plug that into this equation, and I get that lambda is equal to minus mg. Okay, so the reaction force, therefore, the force along the the y coordinate, which is qy, is equal to lambda times delta f by delta y, right? Which is equal to minus mg times delta f by delta y is just 1, because f is equal to y, right? So that is it. So this is the generalized, this is the expression for the reaction force along the y-axis. Okay, this is the constraint force along the y-axis. So this is how you apply Lagrange multiplier to obtain the constraint force along the which enforces the constraint that y is equal to 0. Any questions about this? Of course, in this particular example, you could, by Newton's laws, you could see by inspection that this has to be true, the normal reaction. But in a more general setting, if you take the example of a pendulum and you want to obtain the reaction and so on, then it becomes far more difficult to use Newton-Euler's approach. And Lagrangian approach will therefore become a lot more convenient in that particular case. So let me just start with that and leave you with the derivation for the tension in the rod for an oscillating pendulum. Okay, so I have an oscillating pendulum. I'll quickly do that here. I'll not write too many equations because we have been using these examples over and over again. The length is L. Okay, so suppose I want to obtain the tension in this rod. Let me, for the moment, assume that the length L is also a generalized coordinate. In other words, I don't assume that L is constrained to be a constant. So I'll use this capital L to represent that constant value, but small l to represent the general value of L. So I'll have the Lagrange, the kinetic energy to be equal to half times the horizontal speed of this is L theta dot, and that square is the horizontal velocity square. In the radial direction, not in the horizontal, sorry, tangential direction, it is L theta dot, and the radial direction it will be L dot. So the total kinetic energy will be half times the mass of the bob times L theta dot square plus L dot square. Of course, I have the constraint that small l is equal to capital L. This is the constraint equation. L minus capital L equal to 0. So F, therefore, is equal to L minus capital L. That function F, that constraint function F. Okay. What is the potential energy? The potential energy here is due to gravity. So if I choose this as the origin of my system, the potential energy will be equal to minus mg small l times cos theta. Okay. Now the constraint equation has to be incorporated here. I would get the Lagrangian to be equal to L prime to be equal to half m L square theta dot square plus L dot square plus mg L cos theta, because t minus v, plus lambda times f. What is f? L minus capital L. I choose this as a Lagrangian, and I will substitute, treat lambda as another generalized coordinate along with theta and small l. Okay, so this is small l here, which is equal to capital L. Okay, then the equation I get is that ml square theta double dot plus gl sine theta is equal to 0. Is exactly what we got for the theta coordinate, no difference there. But along the L coordinate, I'll get ml double dot minus L theta dot square plus mg cos theta minus lambda is equal to 0. And the third equation will simply, when I take the Lagrange equation for the third generalized coordinate, namely lambda, I get back the original constraint, namely that L minus capital L is equal to 0. Okay. So from these three equations, I can eliminate lambda and also obtain the joint force, also obtain the tension. So since L is a constant equal to capital L, I notice that L double dot has to be equal to 0. So if I substitute that in this equation, I notice that I get lambda to be equal to L theta dot square plus mg cos theta. That's it. Okay. So we have obtained, does this, of course, is m L theta dot square. Sorry, there has to be an m also here. Okay. So does this make sense? Is this in agreement with what we expect? Let us just intuitively check what the tension has to be. Okay. So if this is the bob and it's experiencing a force mg, right? Then the force along the length will be, if this angle is theta, the force along the length is mg cos theta. And that has to be balanced by the tension in the rod. So naturally that has to figure, and that is there here. Great. What is the significance of the second term here? ml theta dot square. So when this is rotating at an angular velocity theta dot, do you agree with me that this bob experiences centrifugal force, right? That centrifugal force is nothing but ml theta dot square, right? So that also has to be balanced by the tension in the rod. And therefore the tension in the rod has to have the centrifugal component plus the gravity component. And therefore intuitively also, if we simply did a force balance along the lines of Newton's laws, we would again get the same expression. And here also we have got the same expression, right? So now that we have obtained lambda, we know that the generalized force along the generalized coordinate is just lambda times delta f by delta L. And we know that this number is equal to 1 for this particular example, because we know that f is equal to small l minus capital L. So therefore that term is going equal to 1. So QL is simply going to be equal to lambda. And we understand how lambda has to have a centrifugal component as well as a gravity component. So although we didn't understand that machinery, that motivation for why this looked the way it did was not clear, why the expression for generalized force looked the way it did, why did we pick this Lagrange multiplier, and other things were not clear. When you apply it to actual problems, you see that it gives you the same results as what you expect. Okay, so that's reassuring. That allows us to apply it to other problems as well. Okay, so at this point, I will stop today's lecture. If there are any questions about whatever I discussed now, I'll be happy to answer them. Any questions? Okay, I don't see any questions. So I shall meet you guys again next Tuesday. Thank you.